bit about the next meetup, or you save that till after our presentation?
I'll save that till after and have Nick do a summary of that.
All right, sounds good. Then our main focus today is our presentation from Bob Sherapata on DevOps for data. And help me welcome them up here. I like to get everybody clapping when we're in the room, but this case we'll just have to jazz hands. Go ahead.
I love it. I'm going to give Josh Limbaum credit too. He graciously offered to help present this, so we're going to try and tag team this and see how well we do.
Nice.
But while Josh brings up the presentation slide, I hope you're still there, Josh.
Oh, I'm still here.
He's going to leave me hanging. I'll talk about what we got going. So first of all, thanks everyone for attending our conversation. Today we're going to be discussing Azure DevOps building and processing. So it's mostly a technical deep dive into building and deploying database projects to an Azure DevOps or an Azure SQL Server database. I'd love to do more of these and talk about how we deploy tabular models and even Power BI and other Azure structures. But today we're focusing on mostly database projects. So I have with me Josh Limbaum. I'm Bob Sherapata, if you're ready to go to the next slide. Bob Sherapata, a little bit about me. I became a geek before it was cool. And the reason I say that is because I think, 20 years, Paul, before you reach the statute of limitations, where it's just like, yeah, I've developed for over 20 years. So that's my way of saying over 20 years. But I grew up as a farm boy, so because of that, I got a love of working with my hands. So I love hands-on home improvement projects. And I'm also really involved in the community, specifically with Scouts BSA, trying to help with our youth during their formative years. But I also love technology, which is why I'm presenting with Josh today.
Great, thanks, Bob. So a little bit about me. I love working in IT and learning about new technologies that are always ever evolving and changing. Some things about me, I also like to spend time with my family, and I'm a huge fan of 3D printing and Dungeons and Dragons. With this pandemic, it's made things quite challenging, but with the Discord going live, going on Twitch, and using webcam with my models, it makes things a lot easier. So with that, we'll take it away from here. So the main goal for today between Bob Sherapata and myself, we wanted to kind of go over a way to remove difficult barriers to entry for automated build and release processes in Azure. We want to provide a working example of deploying database projects to multi-tier target environments. And with that, we're going a little bit of our agenda. So with Azure DevOps, we want to give you all a brief overview. Maybe this is something that you might be interested in and don't really use yet, Azure DevOps. This will kind of give you a little bit of brief overview of what you can use Azure DevOps for. We're going to go over some builds and runs, along with going over mainly of a demo. So majority of this presentation is getting a deep dive and having everyone actually understand how to build their own build pipelines and release pipelines. And everything from this presentation will be available for you to download so that you can easily recreate what Bob and I have just created during this presentation. And then we will finally end with closing remarks. Bob, you might be muted.
I am. What I'm going to do before we get too deep into this is clarify what we mean by DevOps versus Azure DevOps. So DevOps, the practice, which is not what we're going to be talking about. I went and I looked online, search on what the definition of DevOps was, and I saw hundreds, if not thousands, of definitions. And really what I was looking for was something simple that helped give the flavor of what DevOps is, which is the development and operations teams working together during the entire project and maintenance lifecycle. It's a pretty broad definition, but I think it also speaks to the spirit of what DevOps is, which is collaboration between teams that maybe haven't collaborated during development and release processes in the past. Azure DevOps, which is the topic of our discussion today, is a technical framework to help facilitate the DevOps practice. Go ahead, Josh. So just a brief overview of the Azure DevOps. First, there's the planning part, and it involves defining, describing requests, and the capabilities of applications and systems that are being built. So what we're talking about here is project management of solution development, where you can create backlogs, track bugs, and then manage the teams and view the progress of the work that's being performed as the solutions are being developed. Secondly, as we're talking about developing solutions, develop, which involves all aspects of coding, writing, testing, checking in the source control, reviewing, and also approving changes made by team members. Finally, deliver. So DevOps allows you to not only build, but also release the solutions that you are building. And that is delivery in a nutshell. But we're doing that through an automated process to make them scalable, repeatable, and controlled. And finally, operate, and that is involving maintaining, monitoring, and troubleshooting applications in production environments. So continuous integrations and continuous delivery. When we talk about continuous integrations, I like to equate that to building solutions through an automated process, and continuous delivery, which is deploying solutions through an automated process. And really, they go hand in hand. A lot of times when you have builds, a release, it happens almost immediately after. Now, it's not releasing to all environments, but it's still a release in some capacity. The builds typically key off actions in source control, meaning either I checked in a change, or I merged a change into a branch, or I even build at a specific time, which maybe that's not a change in source control, but it still is a build action that is being incurred, that is being done. Automating those builds of those projects and solution, which is when those actions occur, instead of somebody going out and manually kicking off a build or manually building their solutions themselves, creating an automated process that does that for you. During that process, you create artifacts, which essentially are the remnants of a build that will be used to release your solution. And finally, automated deployments, and that is that release that I was speaking about. Next slide.
Great. And with that, we have the pipelines, which is the builds and releases. And all these things that we see here on this slide relates to Azure DevOps with a build pipeline and release pipeline. With the continuous integration being a build pipeline, continuous delivery with being a release pipeline, we have different environments as to how you can actually do your deployments based on if you're working in a dev environment, a stage, a QA, a production environment. The different pipelines is you can have various different pipelines that you can use for releases of your different environments, or you can have the different pipelines of doing a build pipeline or a release pipeline. With the runs, you can have your data also, or your changes being brought into stage. You can have different steps as to you can have it so you can have all your changes go to a dev environment first, and then you have to then get approval, and you can set up different triggers as to how you get your data and how you get your changes moved throughout all these different environments. Now, with that, we're going to go straight to the demo. So in our example here, Bob Charapata and myself set up an Azure SQL database. We set up an environment for dev, and we set up an environment for production. Now in this, I've made a few changes, and we're going to go through that whole process together based on pretending that this is a project for us right now. So you're going to come out to Azure DevOps. You can see here that Bob and I created a project called DevOps Modern DW. In here, we're going to give you a little brief summary of, overview of actually what's in Azure DevOps. Here you can see a summary. You can see the members. You can see your pipeline information with your builds and your deployment successions, your work items. So you can go down here to different dashboards. Here we created these widgets that actually Microsoft has you get set automatically. You can go out here and add different widgets to your dashboard. And here we want to just kind of showcase our release and build pipelines over time. So you can actually see how your releases are doing, if you've had any failed or if you had any successes. Along with having a nice wiki out here that you can actually publish code as a wiki, or you can create a project wiki to make sure that everything is in one centralized location when we're working on a project. We have our boards here. You can create various work items. You can have different boards you can set here as well of different tasks that you can create. You can create different backlogs, and based on the methodology that we go through on a day-to-day basis at work is agile methodology. Here we kind of just set up something with our board. Bob and myself created this as if we were working on a real project. We created a task for ourselves to kind of create procs, add database projects, create different pipelines, test pipelines. Gave us a great way that we could kind of go through and keep ourselves accountable when working through this, along with queries. Bob, take it away with repository.
Yeah, absolutely. So with repositories, there are two different repositories that are available inside of your or inside of Azure DevOps. You can create a Git repository or a TFVC repository. For this particular project, we created a Git repository. In here, you can track all the different files that are part of your current branch that you're working on. You can also look at history of the different commits that you've created inside of your repository, and also all the pushes. You can look at the different branches that you have available. Right now, we only have master, but if you had more, you could look at multiple different branches, and you can see that there are some different test feature branches that we have with some development that we're performing on the AdventureWorks DW. You can tag your branches right inside of here, which is essentially typically what you do is when you release a branch, and you'll see that we're actually monitoring the master branch as we move forward in our demo. But when you release a branch to production, typically you would tag that branch so you know what release that branch corresponds to. And then finally, pull requests, and you can use this feature in order to make sure that you can perform some sort of a code review process. And it's as formal as you want it to be. Typically what you do in this pull request process is when you're trying to merge one branch in a Git repository to another branch. And typically you want to have somebody else approve it. A lot of times a good comment is more than enough, especially if both people who are reviewing the code know what is supposed to be contained in the change. But you can also have it be a very detailed process as well, where somebody requests a merge, and before the merge is completed, that you actually sit down and review all the code. Right now, because the pull request part of this is not a topic for the DevOps, I'm not going to demonstrate it, but it is neat from the perspective that you can see not only the code that's included in the pull request, but also the user story. If you're using DevOps as your project management board, you can see the user story that's associated with the change that's being brought into source control. All right, so on to pipelines, and I'll hand it right back over to you, Josh.
All right, thanks, Bob. Now, in here, we're kind of just showcasing right now of an actual pipeline that we created ahead of time. For this example, Bob and I are going to show you at the very beginning of actually creating a new pipeline for that build. So we're going to go here to the new pipeline button, and you can see that there's a bunch of different options that you can actually select from. Based on the demo that we're doing right now, we're doing an Azure repository Git right here. So we're going to be using this YAML selection. From here, we're going to be selecting our repository, which is our DevOps Modern DW. And here you can see that there's a bunch of actually different configurations you can select for your pipeline. You can have .NET, you can do Smarter, Xamarin, Android, C++, Docker. There's a lot of different options. And based on the example that we're going to be providing today, we found best for this example for moving database objects is we were going to be using this universal Windows platform. So when we go out here and click out here, you can see that this YAML gets generated. So in this YAML, you can actually go out and edit to maybe different options that you're going to be doing within your actual build pipeline. And it's okay if you don't understand how to use YAML or you don't know how to use development for YAML. You can actually go out here into the Show Assistant. You can see various different options out here that you can actually use for yourself. So instead of just doing, like, you can do an Azure copy file, you can do Azure IoT Edge, or you can even do a deployment. So if you want to, you can even go out here and you can actually put in the information that you're looking for, and you can then select add. And what this does is it'll add that YAML right in here for you to actually go through your whole process of what you're trying to run. But for this example, we're not going to be using an Azure database deployment because we're not doing a deployment here. We're just doing a build. So from here, I'm going to go into our actual pipeline that we have built ahead of time.
So what Josh means when he's saying that we're not using an Azure SQL deployment and we only want to do a build is typically when you're performing a build and you have a release, you want to make sure that you separate them out so that your build succeeds when you're trying to just create your solution. And then when you're deploying, that you deploy separately, and that allows you to use that same build for multiple deployments, whether it's to a single environment, like a dev environment, or if you're practicing environment promotion, which is promoting from dev to QA to stage to production. So that's why we're not including it, although it is an option, and that's really what Josh wanted to show you there, that you could put that in your build. However, then if your deployment fails, then your whole build fails.
That's right. Now,
so go ahead, Josh.
Nope. I was just going to showcase right here. So when we had our actual created pipeline, you can see here that we can actually look at a recently created pipeline or recently run. If you actually click down here, it actually gives you a whole history up to 30 days. You can change that as well based on your different runs that you've had in the past. And if you ever want to actually look at your existing pipeline that you have, you go out here and you would click edit. Now in here, Bob, do you want to kind of showcase a little bit on here?
Yeah, I can talk about what's going on here. So like Josh said, we just chose a default template. I can't remember what one that was, Josh. Do you know?
The one that we've done for this example, or are you talking about?
It was a universal build platform as well.
Yep, correct.
It says so right there on top. So we created a universal build platform. The reason being is because it most closely fit the sort of things that we were trying to do in this demonstration, which is to create a build of a database solution and then also take the output, which is a DAC pack and some other files, and pop them out into an artifacts directory. And that is only the build section. But notice in the YAML that as we built it, it shows that it triggers off of the master branch in the Git repository that we are using. Right now, we have it only built off of the master branch, but you can also include other branches if you're interested in doing that. There are also variables that are included inside of this YAML, which just helps us to keep track of the different ways that we could build it. So we could build multiple different solutions. We can have a particular platform that we want to build to, or we can change it, right? And then the build configuration that we want to use. In this situation, since we're practicing environment promotion or promotion of our release across multiple environments, what we want to do is have that build configuration be set for the final environment that we are promoting our release to. And then we have a couple of NuGet installer and NuGet package commands here, just to set up NuGet packaging for distribution of our artifacts. Finally, well, I guess not finally, next part is the build of the actual solution, which is just a Visual Studio build based off of our solution parameter, our build platform, and our configuration. And that'll produce our DAC pack that we are going to deploy. Now, DAC packs, when you perform this action, is one of the outputs of the build, but also the other outputs that we need are something that we need to be able to grab from different directories as we set our artifacts for our build. And so what we have to do in addition to performing the build is we have to take that output and then copy it out to a artifacts directory. So we have this artifacts directory, and notice in the source folder that we have this full big long path. And the reason that we do is because if we put a path into the content section of this YAML, what'll happen is the artifacts directory will actually create this path in the artifacts, and we don't want that. The reason that we don't want it is for this demo, we only have 3 artifacts that we are going to be creating for our release. And so we want a fairly flat file structure in our artifacts directory. If we wanted a more robust structure, say if we have multiple projects with multiple artifacts that are going to be created, we may want to create a folder specifically for DAC packs. We may want to create another folder that's specific for publish.xml. And you could do that by adding a path right here into the content section of this YAML or the copy files task. But for right now, like I said, we wanted to keep it flat. And then also notice that this build.artifact staging directory is available as a parameter as well, which is something that's given to you by default in your build profile. And you can set it, and actually, I was going to show you where to set it, but DevOps has changed since we gave this presentation last, so now I've got to go find it. And actually what I'll do is I'll put that as an action item for a follow-up on this presentation. And then finally, once we have all of our files in place in our artifacts directory, then we want to make sure to publish those artifacts. And what this step does is that makes those artifacts available for our release to pick up and use for deployment. Notice as well, when you're looking at this screen, that in the breadcrumb up here on top, it's a breadcrumb that is very similar to a source control breadcrumb. Well, the reason is because that's exactly what it is. This is the path in our source control that this YAML file will get stored. And you can see that this is the branch that I'm storing that YAML file in. I can also switch to different branches. What I really like about this, above any other build and deployment tool that I've used, is that now you can store your build into source control, and you can experiment, and if you don't like or you're not happy with the results, then you can always go back to a previous version. In a lot of other build tools that are available out there, that is absolutely not true, and you kind of got to save off your build that you know is the last known good one, and copy it and then put it back, or remember what the configuration was if you want to go back to a previous version. So to me, that's one of the biggest advantages of using the build pipeline in Azure DevOps. I think that's it for the build. Josh, do you have anything else to add?
I don't have anything else to add, but we can run it right now so that we can kind of showcase through that whole process.
All right,
so
sounds good.
I'm going to go up here, and I can actually go out and actually run this whole process right now. Right here, we're going to select our branch that we're running it off of. You can select the various different branches, but based on this example we're going through, we're going straight to the master. You can have different variables you can have set. You can have stages to run and resources. We're going to leave everything set to default. We're going to be running this right through.
Are you guys taking any questions as you go through this at all?
Yeah, absolutely.
We can, yeah.
I thought of one as I was watching. I'm a little new to this, so sorry if it's a stupid question, but we're doing a build right now, but I'm not sure what that accomplishes on a database project. So this is about bringing in the change, the new table, and making sure that nothing breaks in the database, essentially, by doing a build. What are we accomplishing?
So what we're accomplishing as we're performing the build is just making sure that our code is releasable at this point in time, just like you do when you're building a database project in SQL Server data tools as you're designing it. So right now it's not deploying, it's not making sure that it's able to be published. We're just making sure that it's producing essentially the artifact that I was speaking about, which is a DAC pack that you can then take and then deploy to a SQL Server database.
Okay, gotcha.
All right. So what's happening here is actually it's done. But what I was going to show you, or have Josh show you, is bring up the YAML that we had actually copied into a notebook to show you that it does actually correspond with the different steps that we created. So you can see that it got the latest change and initialized the job first, but then it did these NuGet tasks and it performed the build, used the copy task to copy the DAC files, and notice they're named exactly what we called the display name the display name is, and then finally published the artifacts. The last three steps are just automatically included in the build process. So, Josh, you want to talk a little bit about the logging and what you can look at?
So yeah, so when you're going out here as well, you can actually back out. You can see the different logs that we have set up based on previous runs. But on top of that, so you can actually go out here and see how long it's run, how long ago you've done it. So when you go in here, you can actually look at your artifacts. So before I quick switch screen, it actually showed work items, and right here it said artifacts. You can actually click here and you can see our built artifacts out here for our DAC pack. You can see our XML for our published profile for production and development.
Notice when he was back in this screen where it said one published, that is one published artifact. It does not reference the number of files that are contained in that artifact. So then that begs the question, can you have multiple different artifacts published with a build? I haven't tried it, but I think that you can. We could try that and see if that would work. I don't know why you would want to versus having a properly structured artifact directory, but that's what that one publish means. It does not correlate to the number of files that are available in the artifact.
Now with that, as we finished our build pipeline, we have successfully created our build pipeline now so that we can use this for future reference. So now we're going to go on to our release pipelines.
Actually, before we go to the release pipelines, I'd like to show one more thing about the build pipeline.
No, go right ahead, Bob.
If you're looking at the build pipeline, you can actually click on it and it'll give you the history like Josh said. But what I really like about the build pipeline is notice that there are a couple times where we actually erred. That doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's really nice because you can then click on that build pipeline and you can see specifically where those errors occurred. But if you want a little bit more detail, you can actually click on the job down here below. And when you click on that, what it does give you is those different steps that we were walking through as we performed our build. And it shows you the step that failed. You can click on that step and then look at the log inside of the error. And it helps you to be able to troubleshoot where the problem occurred during your build. So it's kind of nice to be able to look at that and then reference back to it as you try to fix the build if you do have errors that occur during your build process. All right, now I think I'm ready for releases.
All right. So right away, you can see that we actually had some releases that we did ahead of time here. So for this, Bob and I are going to do the same thing like we did for the build pipeline. We're going to be creating a new release pipeline. So as you can see here, you can do an import of a release pipeline that you have already created, but we're going to be doing a brand new one. So as you can see here, we have our artifacts and our stages. Right away, it's asking for your stage. You would want to select a template. So there's all these different various options that you can actually select when doing a deployment and a release pipeline. So you can do deploy the Kubernetes cluster. You can do an Azure cloud service deployment, Azure policy deployment. There's various different options that you can actually select from, which is great. It's ever always changing. But in this, we're going to be creating an empty job. We're going to be calling this just like dev. And then we're going to be adding our artifact. So there's these different choices that you have for an artifact. There's a build, there's an Azure repository, there's a GitHub, and the TFVC. There's all these different options that you have when you're actually adding an artifact. For this example, we're going to go through and we're going to use a build. We're going to be using our Azure DevOps, Modern DW. We can grab a different version if we'd like, but for ours, we're going to do the latest and we can add it. So this is a pretty simple, easy step that you can go through. You can actually create your different release pipelines. You can create another stage if you'd like. You can even branch off from here. But since we already have one of these already created, we're going to go into the one that already exists and go through that one together.
For the different pipelines that Josh was showing, that you can use as your trigger, notice that essentially one of the triggers was the build, and the other triggers are version control. So I really like to lump them into two. And so if you're not going to be performing your release directly off of your build pipeline, I've seen situations where people just want to create a build and then constantly check in artifacts of those builds into their build pipeline and then potentially reference them for a release later. So that's why those other options are there, so that you can actually use source control as your source for your releases.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
With this right now, you've had a case where a new table was checked in, and I'm a little confused as to, now this is about building a release, and in this case, if a new table was added to the database project, the release is really about creating the necessary scripts to get it deployed to a database area, say an SQL Server or an Azure SQL managed instance.
The release is actually deploying the change to the servers.
Okay.
So the dev that Josh is referencing here is actually a development environment, and the prod is a production environment.
Okay.
So, and we'll talk about
when you were bringing up options, it was like there was a lot of endpoints like Kubernetes and things like that, and I was kind of like, I don't see how those relate to, we added a new table to a database.
right.
How
Right.
does someone know?
They don't, but what we're doing is just kind of just showcasing the other options they have out here, because this
Okay.
doesn't always have to be a database project that you're
Okay.
setting out to do deployments. We're just showcasing everything that it actually has to offer.
Gotcha. Okay.
So some of what's in there, which is kind of nice for that are database project specific, is there are containers if you happen to be managing containers for your target environments. There's actually an option for some Redgate deployments. So if you don't use SQL Server database projects, you can use Redgate as a way to deploy your change. And I think most of the time that's through executing a script. But there's all kinds of, it isn't just code specific, as you saw. And that's kind of the point, is especially as you're exploring more options in Azure, there are other options for deploying to different Azure structures. Like I said, we're only touching on database projects right now. So there's also tabular model deployments. I haven't checked and see if there's like a Power BI deployment in there as well. But you can deploy to Azure Analysis Services and other things like Azure Data Factory. So all these different structures that are included in Azure that could be something that's included in a modern data warehouse project.
Good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So as we go out here, as Bob was stating before, we have our two environments that we showcased before of our SQL databases, of being a dev environment and also our production environment. We went out here and we set up our artifacts so that we made it look like at our current repository with our build pipeline that we have out there. We went out there and worked on this dev task. So you can actually go out here, you can go to our dev tasks. We can look at our deploy using our DAC pack. And in here, we set up all of our various different options. There's the display name, the SQL, the deploy SQL using, the DAC pack file location here. We're going to be specifying the SQL using. We're using the server. We're going to put in our actual server name here. You can put in our actual database name. So you can actually set up various variables if you're working in a dev environment or a production environment. We'll showcase that in a minute, along with a username and also a password. Here you can see that we have also set up, based on our build artifacts, of our published profile. So as you can see here, where we had these different database names, the username and the password, you can go out to the variables here. You can actually see various different variables that we have set. We have set for a dev environment, a production environment, different passwords, the database user that you're going to be using, the deploy environment, and the for dev and production.
Notice in the variables that Josh is showing that there's 3 different scopes. So typically, every scope that you have is the different environments that you're deploying to. So you saw that in this particular pipeline, he had that we were deploying to dev and to production, but there's also release. And the release scope is essentially any environment. So notice that for like the database name, there's a different value in there for the dev environment than there is for prod. So that is a situation where you're going to want to separate them out and make sure that they have the proper scope for the environment that you're deploying to. However, for the database username, it's the same. And so you use the release scope, which means that it'll apply it to all the environments that you have set up in your Azure release pipeline.
So from here, we're going to go back and we're going to look at our dev environment. As you can see, we have this continuous deployment trigger. So before, when we did our building, it would just did a basic build, but when you do a release pipeline, you can actually set it here in your artifact to do a continuous deployment trigger. What this does is that as soon as you have done a successful build, it'll do a deployment directly to your next step, which is our dev environment. So we're going to set that, make sure that I save it off. And in here, you can see that we have this pre-deployment set up for these different conditions. So right here, you can see a select trigger. You can do various different options. You can do an after release, an after stage, or you can do a manually push as well. You can set up the artifact filters, various schedules, and pull request deployments here, along with pre-deployment approvals, which we'll go over shortly, and gates. So in this option, Bob and I actually had this set up where we're going to be setting up post-deployment approvals here. So as you can see, we enabled this here. Now we have approver set. So I set Bob at Sharapata to make sure he's the one that's going to be doing the approvals before this can actually get moved on to the next step. So right here, Bob, I think we're ready for checking in the new table and kicking that build pipeline off.
Yeah, I'm excited to see it. Hopefully it worked.
Yeah. So out here, just to begin, we're going to be looking at our dev environment here. I created a table called Azure DevOps. So we're going to go out here to our Adventure Works. We're going to be out here and say, all right, well, I worked in my local environment. I got all my changes all set, doing a refresh, and it looks like, oh, the table is not showing up yet. And it's not expanding.
None of them are.
None of them are showing up. So
because we're working in Azure.
Yeah. So right here, we can go out and we can actually go out to our pipelines. We're going to go out and go to Visual Studio. As you can see, I created this new table called Azure DevOps. Got it checked out right now. I'm going to go out like it was if we were working on any other project. I'd be like checking in, new table. So I'm going to be committing those changes. I'm going to come out here and I'm going to sync my changes out, push. Now, as soon as I hit this push, it's now going to be triggering my build pipeline and it's going to be doing a build. So I can go out here, I'll be going off on environments, go to build. Oh, look at that. It's currently running a process. So I can see it's running my last run for checking in a new table. We can actually see the run and how it's going through again. So we can go down to the job. Again, we can go and see the different steps that it's running through as we followed along with our YAML that we built before. we can actually
So-
follow along. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Bob.
What I want to point out here is that there's that initialize job step. When you're working with Azure, you can potentially have, especially with Azure DevOps, you can have a build server that's available for you to manage all of your builds. And really what it comes down to is the build agent. And that particular agent, if you build it yourself, then you got to manage in your build, spinning that environment up, and then letting it perform the build, and then tearing it back down when it's done. But what we used when we created our build here is we used an Azure agent, which then Azure essentially takes care of all of that for you. And the other advantage to that is now you're not paying for a VM that you're only using when you're performing a build. It'll actually spin that environment up and then tear it down after the build is completed. So that's what that step was all about. And that's what it does when it finalizes the job as well.
All right. I'm going to go here. We saw that our job has been successfully run through. It has finalized the job. We're going to go down to our releases now. So in here, you can actually see our new release of release 7 is kicking off, and it's currently on our dev environment. So you can click in, you can actually see the progress that's going through. We can see that it kicked off immediately after we set that setting to make sure that as soon as we did a successful build, it would kick off this process. We can see that it initialized the job, did a download of the artifact that we had of our build artifacts. And then it's now deploying using our DAC pack.
Let's see if that database refreshed for you yet with all the objects from before. So yeah, so you can see that the object that we created before is still is not available in our dev database. So when this deployment is finished, then Josh should be able to refresh that, and you should see that it not only built that new table that he added, but it also published it to the database. So Josh, if you want to go back and refresh that.
Do a refresh. Going down to my tables. Hey, look, my new table's there. New Azure DevOps. That's great. Cool. Hey, Bob. I mean, I should be able to look at now in our production environment, right?
Yeah, let's make sure it's in production.
Okay, hold on. We got a problem here, Bob.
What'd you do?
Well, I don't see it in production.
You know why? Because I didn't approve it.
That's right.
Your change was awful, and the QA team said no, you can't have it. Well, actually, right now they're reviewing it, and so after they're done reviewing the change and making sure that it passes the requirements of the story, they'll approve it. And so actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the role of QA, and I'm going to approve this process behind the scenes for right now, because we also have another approval coming up, and Josh can walk you through how that occurs. So I'm just going to do this, but you'll see even on Josh's screen that once that approval is complete, if the button actually behaves for me, which it's not right now, we'll get there.
And the great thing about it is too, you don't always have to go out here to approve it this way. You can always also go out to your email. It sends you an actual email to let you know, hey, something has just been completed and it's now waiting for your approval. And you can approve it right through your email as well. So as I can see here, as Bob was stating before, we're kind of playing the role, looks like, of QA, which is great. It looks like I'm going to be playing the role of doing a DBA role of doing a deployment. So as you can see, we did a deployment though that it was saying, yep, so we have a QA, someone tested it and everything approves it, we're ready to go to production. Well, we typically don't want to just push everything to production. We want to make sure that we have like a set time as to when we're doing our releases, or if we'd like another set of eyes to look at it. So we set ourselves up as another pending approval, which is myself. I can look at it and look at the changes that have gone through and be like, yep, looks like everything's looking good. I would then
Could you hold on a sec and tell me more about how you're seeing what's going through for this approval?
So I can always go through the view logs and I can actually go and see, okay, so it looks like this change has come through. I can go out to the actual pipeline and I can say, okay, well, what changes did we go through? Which branches are we going through for this continued deployment, and what builds were successful at this time?
Like you could see the statement that says add the table, because I'm not seeing where you're able to see that on the screens you just showed.
Right. So this would just show in for your logs. So you can see the approval. It's just going out here to actually approve your process from here. But what you would have to do is you would most likely have to go back to your pipeline, go out to your build pipeline and see what was recently kicked off.
So this is where tagging comes into play. If you remember when I was referencing tags in your repositories, you could potentially have a branch that has a tag. And in this situation, it was this change 6 minutes ago that is in progress, and it even shows right in your branches what's going on. So it kind of correlates it to that build that we are performing, or that release that we're performing right now. So it's saying that the change that was committed to this particular branch is what is in progress to be released.
Sure.
I can then
part of what I don't see is like it doesn't tell me what is actually being done, like that a new table is being added.
Right. So I can explore then that change and look at the history. If I had a pull request, I could look at the history and click on that particular commit, and then it'll show me actual code of what's being done. So if you had a pull request, which we're not showing here, then you would also have that documented comment along with that pull request that says, hey, I created a new table and it's the Azure DevOps table. So that's as close as you can get to understanding what's in a release. But you can dig all the way down to the details if you really need to.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
You bet.
Great. Well, we can get back to our release pipeline now. Go down to our releases. See the one that we have currently waiting in production. We can finally give this approval. It looks great. And we're now getting everything queued up and ready for deployment down to our production environment. Going through our agent job, downloading the artifact again, and now we're using the deployment using the DAC pack.
So any other questions while we're waiting for this release? This will take a minute to get this little piece done.
So this piece is actually deploying to production, creating the new table, essentially.
Correct.
Okay.
So one of the things when we're talking about releasing and release stages is you can also look at history of your release. And what you could see, where is it, Josh? I wanted to show the different approval processes in the release pipeline.
You want to actually look at our release pipeline and look at the whole process that way? Or do you want me to create a new pipeline? You can see that process through.
No, I want to see the different releases. Here we go. This is what I was after.
Yep.
I couldn't remember where to click. You can see that this particular release is sitting in a phase where it's being ready to be pushed to production. If you had another build, let's say you had another table that was changed or needed to be changed, but this release wasn't approved for production yet. And maybe it's because you knew you had another change coming, or maybe there was a bug in this release, and so we weren't going to go to production with it. The release of the next build will not actually occur until you either release this current build or you abandon it. So in other words, let's say that this particular line is the one that looked like the one above. The dev release would not occur because it's still waiting for you to decide what you're going to do with the prior release. Let's say release 6. So when you're done with that release, you either have to say, nope, I'm not going to deploy this at all. I'm going to abandon it, which you'll see we actually did down here for release 2. Or I'm going to approve it and deploy to production. Then I can start my next release cycle to dev and then across my other environments. So going back to our current release, we got to be getting close to this getting deployed to production on queue.
And as you can see here, we got our new table finally working in production. We got our new deployment, and it shows a little bit of how instantaneously you can get your dev environment updated with your newest changes with your builds, and how you can go through the process of getting it deployed down to your production environment. And with that, that concludes our demo. And as you can see, we had a way for you to find out how you can actually go through Azure DevOps. You got a brief overview on how we had the repository set up, boards, work items, summaries, builds for build pipelines and release pipelines. We got to go through a great example of actually how to set up an actual environment to do a build pipeline along with doing a release pipeline of doing a table change or creating a new table. And if you have any questions for Bob and I, we'll be on the phone for a while, or you can feel free to email us. And if anyone would like to download the YAML from everything that was actually used and provided today in this presentation, we'll be sure to hand off those links you can get from either on the FoxPass website, from the Fox Valley Microsoft Data Platform Users Group, or from SQL Saturday. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But it is still out there from the previous year, and you can also see a great reference to other Azure DevOps presentations done by some other Skyline associates.
Thanks so much. Now, I invite people in the meetup to type a chat question in, or if they, we haven't had a lot of people unmute to ask questions, but this is a good opportunity. Feel free to unmute now and ask a question. I have a couple if someone doesn't chime in right away.
I've got one, Paul.
Go ahead.
So Bob and Josh, the artifacts, where are those stored? Like, do they go out to a slot or like a storage account? Or are they stored in DevOps?
So they are stored in DevOps, and that is actually a very interesting question, because all I've ever been able to get when I'm looking at the artifacts directory is a relative path. So I have no idea other than somewhere in Azure DevOps. Now, if you notice down below on the bottom, there is an artifacts page on the bottom left. And I thought, well, it would just make sense that they'd be there. Well, they're not there either. So unfortunately, I don't really have a good answer as to where those things are. I do know that it's not in a corresponding Azure portal. It must be sitting in this Azure DevOps instance somewhere. I've just been unable to find where they are.
Okay. Probably isn't that important. I just ask because sometimes you provision things in Azure and you get these other things provisioned for you. And then it's good to know of them because, they have additional costs and just different management things. So.
Yeah. And I've always thought, boy, I hope I'm not getting billed for, the storage of these artifacts, especially when we're talking about, let's say you have 50 builds or 100 builds and you're not cleaning up your artifacts.
Yeah.
You're paying for that, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Josh, guys, it's Mike. Just wondering, does this also work for an on-prem configuration as well? Storing, being able to do with your on-prem architecture?
Yes, it does. And there's a lot of different configurations that Azure DevOps will support. You can even have your repository on premises, perform your builds in the cloud in Azure DevOps, and then even deploy to an on-premises SQL Server or tabular model if you really want to. So that's one extreme, or you can have all Azure or any combination of any of those things.
Yeah, pretty exciting.
Go ahead.
Yeah, pretty exciting stuff. So then I'm guessing it would also work for all the platforms that Azure supports too as well. So it could use you could use other databases, other sources, and other destinations.
Yeah, we talked about deploying to an Azure Data Lake. Like I said, I think I referenced Azure Data Factory. So there's all kinds of different structures that this thing does support. And as you're performing your build and even your release. The nice thing is it has that section off to the right that allows you to pick a lot of those pre-configured structures that you can just pop in and then put in the values that you need in order to deploy to them.
But the cases that I'm wondering about with that are, I mean, if I've got a change that is to a database that's an SQL Server database, I can't just use this to suddenly deploy that to an Azure data lake, because that really, I mean, doesn't make any sense. So
right,
okay,
exactly. Unless there's like a script, like let's say that you had a script that you managed inside of your database. I'm just trying to think of a situation where maybe you'd want to do something like that. Maybe a script or a file that gets stored in your database, but maybe doesn't get included in your build. But you still can pop that in your artifacts directory and then put that file into a data lake.
Okay. There is a question in the chat. Can you see it there?
I'm sharing my screen right now, so it's hard for me to see it, Bob.
It says, is it quick to show how the release is tied to agile tasks?
Yes. Bear with me. Yes. So let's say we have a branch. I think we'd have to have, let me think about this. We have to have a change on another branch and then merge it into this one. So luckily I have a couple of other branches out here. So this is a situation where you'd use a pull request. So you take that and you create a new pull request. And I could say merge, I don't know, this particular branch into master. And then you'd give it some title that makes sense, just like that one. And then you can actually associate it to work items in your pull request. So you can associate it to a task, you can associate it to a story, an issue, any number of things. You can actually relate it to multiple as you're performing that pull request. Unfortunately, you don't do that at a commit level. It really is when you're taking that branch and you're merging it into the branch that is being monitored and released to these different environments. So when you create this pull request, you can then subsequently go back and review that pull request and then look at the changes that were created. I did reference earlier that you can see the code that's actually included with that pull request as well. So this is that level of granularity that you can look at that detail of what that change is. But this is the only place that I know of where you can associate that with the line that you're monitoring, with the branch that you're monitoring for a build and a release. Is that yeah, okay.
I think so, yeah. And if someone has another question, feel free to unmute or type it in.
I've got one.
Go ahead.
So can you speak to why you chose that universal template for the when you built your build pipeline over some of the other ones? Is that just because it supports just the different kind of steps you needed to do in there best, or?
Yes, it did. There were some extra steps in there that we actually removed and some extra parameters for our Visual Studio build. But the 3 steps that we were after when we created this demo were building in Visual Studio, copying files to the artifacts directory, and then publishing artifacts. And that universal template had all 3 of those things that allowed us to do those actions without having to worry about trying to find them and add them individually.
Right. Okay, cool, thanks.
You're welcome.
I have a question that I might need to step back to a higher level on the goal behind doing this kind of thing with Azure DevOps and having some pipelines and deployment tasks and that kind of build and release type processing with all this is to help I would imagine control cases in database work where you might have a database that's being used by and developed on by multiple people. One person's creating a table, another person is creating a view that references that table, and someone else is cleaning up and getting rid of tables. And so by using this, people then with Visual Studio against their databases are checking in their changes and having it pulled together, and the build process kind of verifies that one guy didn't remove a table that was referenced by another person's view that they added. Is that why we do this? I'm having a little trouble with why this is so helpful.
Sure. So actually, your why is more around version control. That's where you would police or at least manage the changes that is being performed by a distributed team. Where DevOps really comes in handy is especially when you're talking about a fast release process, where maybe you're releasing 2 to 3 times in a week. What you want to be able to do is manage that release in an automated way, because as we know, the more you add different solutions, different structures to your projects, the more cumbersome it becomes to release. I've been involved in release processes where a whole team stands up in a room, a team of 20 stands up in a room and talks about how they're going to release on a daily basis for about a half an hour. And then everybody goes and releases the project for the next hour. And that was just getting it to QA. So you think about just the amount of time, and that's an extreme case, of course, but you think about the amount of time that you release, especially if you're releasing on a very iterative cycle. What DevOps does is it just saves you the time of the repeatable process that you may be doing every day or multiple times a day, even if it's just to a dev environment to test the features that you're creating. And it isn't just for a database team. It's becoming more useful across all paradigms of solutions that are being developed, whether it's an analytics solution, an application, or just database management. And the reason that we're presenting at the BI group is because when we're talking about data warehouses, that database is obviously the core structure in some data warehouse projects.
Yeah, I think part of what the lens, and I'm having some trouble seeing how to relate the demo you did with why we'd use it. And, from my lens comes from years of dealing with databases and SQL Server. And before you get to this DevOps techniques of pulls and pipelines and that kind of thing, you had people working within their table structures. They'd add a field, and then there'd be a deployment script that would add that field to dev and add that field to production. The complexities that you showed in the demo that go into the build process, there's no building to me with a lot of database projects. You've added a field to a table. That doesn't require recompiling. That doesn't require a reference to some external DLL to make certain is included in the deployment of an exe that's going to be running somewhere on Windows. So some of this seems very developer focused, but I have a real hard time finding value in adding this to my process with my databases.
So Paul, this is Jorge Simon. How are you guys?
Hey, good. Thanks.
So I'm the BI manager at Plexus, and we are looking at this technology, and I can offer my point of view, Paul.
Yeah,
that may help, right? So we do have a lot of handoffs, I guess, or segregations of duties, right? So we need to create the scripts as the BI guys in development. We need to put it into QA. We script the thing and we put it to QA. Sometimes we have to give it to the DBAs for them to push the F5. So we call them the F5 monkeys in a way, right? With all the respect to the DBAs. And then they come back and they said this thing failed, didn't work, or whatever, right? Or they go through, and then we get to our change management cycle to get it to production. So at that point, we cannot touch it from the BI point of view, and they need to go and execute this stuff. And again, the same cycle if something fails or whatever. I'm looking at this technology to completely eliminate the DBAs out of the picture. So I can have a self-documented process of when we release something to production through the pipelines. I get it that there's an investment, in getting this pipeline set up, but once you set them up, and they work, you don't have to touch them again.
Okay.
It's just the one initial time actually creating it. This is actually a question that came up last time when Bob and I actually presented this topic. It was the same thing of like, well, why would I want to set this up? It looks kind of tedious of getting it set up. Yeah, for the first time, getting everything set up, we'll be providing the YAML afterwards that you guys can actually help you recreate this process. But it lets the DBAs working on more important topics, and it lets the actual BI developers or any of the other developers just go in, test their changes, make their changes quick without having to do all this red tape.
Sure. Okay. I have less experiences with probably more mature processes like Jorge is describing, because in most of my years of kind of working on this, there isn't as many handoffs. The teams I've been on for BI wise are kind of responsible for getting the deployments into production. We don't hand scripts to a DBA to run. We run the scripts and deployment at the time that we want to deploy to production. So some of this is, there's not other people we have to kind of coordinate, and there's no approval processes that are necessary. So they're probably just some of my experiences here. I'm not yet seeing the value for me, but thanks for helping with that.
Yeah, the other thing that I can offer, in here is that we do use the Beef framework. You guys have heard that tool from Skyline, right? Yeah. So to your point, right, you add a field or you add a table or something really simple, right? Beef behind the scenes is creating all kinds of objects, synonyms and store procs and whatnot, right? You're not even aware of all the stuff that thing creates, behind the scenes. So this would allow you to basically pick up all of the objects that were changed by a simple adding a column to a table. And then that movement of that data from our staging to the EDW or to whatever you want to move it to, so this is going to pick up all of the objects that basically you're touching.
Gotcha. Yep.
Under your tag, I guess, you gotta have some discipline on your source control for this thing to actually pick it up.
Yep. Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have something to offer too, in the kind of the context of things like George going through here, and working in larger teams, especially disparate teams today. So you could have basically people or peeps all over the world do different parts to a larger project. This would help you orchestrate, coordinate, and put the approvals in the right places, so that the orchestration only happens when it's basically verified. So it works best for really large and complicated teams to kind of pull it all together and automate the entire thing at any environment, and be able to point it at any environment. Because I've had to do it with just scripts and then basically get those. And like you was shown here, is you would automate it using data-driven techniques by basically setting up variables and different variables to define the processes, especially the endpoint being production and the release. So I don't know if that helps, but when you can kind of manage everything on your own because you have a tight, small enough team, it doesn't make as much sense maybe. But when it does is when you can hand it to someone else and they can just utilize it to basically let the developer continue to support and do the work to do enhancements. And then people would verify that it works, and then they could still continue to use this process. Anyway, so
that's
kind of cool.
Any other questions before I insert another one that I had?
I have one for Jorge. Jorge, this is Nicole. Are you also using the Azure DevOps as your source control for Power BI?
We were playing with the DevOps on Azure, and because it's a cloud tool, we're kind of not allowed. So we're looking into TFS, or the latest release of TFS, which is the DevOps on-prem, and we are moving from TFS to Get as the source control.
So Nicole, on your question, I mean, there really is no source control in Power BI. So are you asking if you're having people check PBIXs in or something? Or?
Yeah, keeping track of your PBIX versions.
Mm-hmm.
We have a very manual, cumbersome, file sharing with the versioning on the files themselves for the PBIXs. It's we thought about using SharePoint and using the check-in, check-out process. Still very painful. Any one of those solutions is very manual, painful.
Yeah, we've used OneDrive with that history as well. So
that is a SharePoint list, right? Yeah.
Yep. I can say that there was an article in my news feeds that talked about there has been I think a Power BI pipeline or part of Azure DevOps, one of those pieces that would then deploy a Power BI report. And I kept that article for future use if I ever saw a use for this whole process. If I dig that out again, I'll put it to the meetup.
Yeah, I think that is using the XMLA extension, endpoint. So we tried that. Actually, it works pretty well. So you could take a project. We have a couple projects in Azure using these pipelines. We deploy the whole thing to Azure, including the PBIX.
Yep, nice.
With all the data. And then the cool thing about that is that you can control all the code that you have running. Somebody mentioned storage pools and whatever, there's artifacts and all this stuff, right? You can control them from Visual Studio and then just deploy them through the pipeline using that XMLA thing to Azure. So that was really cool.
Nice. Another question before I jump with one that I had. There was experiences I've had with this build process with Visual Studio and database projects where Visual Studio has particular rules or best practices it's trying to enforce when it checks out how a database would work that run friction to environments where I've come in. One example is in a SQL Server database, if you have cross database joins where there was a view that was built pulling things from many databases, there's referential issues and stuff that appear within Visual Studio which complicate the whole process. Does anyone have any experiences with that?
What I've done in those situations, I mean, I guess it depends on the different levels of complexity of your scenario, but we've used synonyms before to kind of hide that obscurity. Sure. And then also use the SQL command variables to help make that scale deployable across multiple different environments. Now it's not, I don't know if that's a best practice or not, but it's something that I've used to help. You'll still get an error, or I'm sorry, it'll actually be a warning with the synonym, but you can help prevent the errors that occur during build.
Good, yeah, that's what I remember seeing an article on that as well.
Yep.
I think where my head was at was kind of on these are situations where they work within the database environments that we've got,
right?
Yet we start stepping into tools like this that want to do builds and break apart the deployment of different databases to different environments, and suddenly you can't take what is working code and bring it and control it and deploy it.
Right.
It's to me a limiting factor in the use of tools like this. So
yeah, it's a difficult thing. I've seen a lot of different complexity when you're talking about using database projects, especially when it's a different database on a completely different server. But there are ways within database projects where you can handle that. Like I said, you can use synonyms. You could potentially create a DAC pack of the other database and then keep that in source control with your project, and then reference that DAC pack as one of your referential databases, just so that you can get past a build. and then a deployment would at least be possible then. I'm not sure how well it works, but I think you'd almost have to see what you're dealing with in order to really speak to
Sure.
a good way to solve it.
Yeah, that's been a problem for database projects from the onset, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think you had to build the dependent DAC packs and have references in the one database project to the other, and that's just
I got up close to that, and then I went, "This is not worth my time."
Yeah,
I stopped.
It's hard, but that's part of it.
Yep.
Good. Any other questions anyone has? Anything new in the chat? Let's check real quick. All right, I think we're good there. I thought of one more question. So, which edition of Dungeons and Dragons is the best? Because I have opinions on this.
I like 3.5, Pathfinder, and 5th edition. 5th edition, I think, is actually great. I absolutely love 5th edition.
All right, I got to check that out more. Nice.
Just throwing that out there.
Yeah,
I'm biased.
Any other questions from the group? Feel free. Get them in the chat. All right, got a quiet group tonight. Do you want to put back up your final slide where you had your links and everything there? That would be great, so people can kind of take notes if they're looking to grab any of these, grab a screenshot. Excuse me. Thank you so much for breaking that down and doing that demo today. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, guys. That's great.
So don't everybody sign off right away. Nicole, if you would want to run us through our, prep everybody for what our next meetup is about, and get people thinking about putting that on their calendars.
Is Nick still on the line?
Yep, I'm here.
Hey, there he is.
Nick's going to be presenting, so I'll let him describe his presentation.
Yeah, so basically, the last couple months, we've been doing a Snowflake implementation at Bolt with the Pandata group, and working with Matillion as well. So basically, I'm going to be going through just how this journey came to kind of be in the last year and a half I've been working at Bolt, and how we went from doing a lot of Azure and Azure Data Factory, and then our analytics got a little bit bigger, and we're starting to see some more traction on that. So then we finally looked for something a little bit more robust and chose Snowflake, and basically we did a real quick 10-week POC / where we actually built, I guess I'd call it a data mart, and we're doing a whole bunch of reports for the executive team, putting all that together. So it went pretty quick. Tools are really easy to use, and I'll just be going through the whole process of how that went. So
Nice.
if anybody's interested.
And that's on Tuesday, May 12th at 6 p.m. And we were going to have it at the Bolt Company, but depending on how things are going, that may be online as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking I don't think the company's going to allow that by then for sure.
Okay.
So it's probably best just to plan on online.
Plan for online.
Yeah,
And that's the 12th.
Yeah, May 12th.
I'm putting it on the calendar now.
And I've added the rest of the events through the rest of the year out to the Meetup site. And many of them currently say online